What's up everybody, this is Ryan here, and in today's video I'm going to be showing you how to set up the navigation component from Android Jetpack. Now before I proceed to actually showing you how to build it, I need to be perfectly honest about the fact that I'm not super happy with this library in its current state. Now on the off chance that someone from the Android team watches this, please only take this as constructive criticism. So firstly, as of making this video, the navigation component does not work out of the box with onActivityResult. I did see a couple people had some really hacky shared mutable state solutions for solving this problem, but I wouldn't actually recommend them when it's actually easier to just not use the library in the activity which receives the result, which is what I chose to do in this particular application. So that's kind of one of my criticisms here, is there's kind of a strong push to move to a single activity approach, and this was one case where I wanted to do that and couldn't based on framework limitations. Now, like I say, as I'm making this video, I have seen that there's some discussion about adding integration with navigation and onActivityResult possibly in later versions, although it doesn't appear to be a very high priority. Anyways, in fairness, if you're watching this video several months or even years from now, there's a chance that it has been integrated with the library, and if that's the case, then that would make me very happy. I was also told recently by a friend of mine, who's an awesome programmer, that navigation does not play nice with view pagers and fragments, so another thing to be aware of. So while I'm not really happy about some pretty common use cases having some problems with the library, I think those are things which hopefully will be improved on over time. So let me get to the second reason why I'm not super happy with the library. So I just didn't really feel like the steps required to implement navigation and the fact that we're basically pulling logic out of Kotlin code or Java code and putting it back into XML was really worth the effort of setting up relative to the problems that it actually solved in my applications. So what I'm basically saying here is what this library will do for you is it'll allow you to basically get rid of some of the fragment transaction or start activity type logic which you would normally use to navigate to different screens in your application. And so it's not that we're actually just getting rid of all of that logic. In a sense, we're basically pulling a bunch of it out into an XML file, and then we're having this framework generate a lot of that logic for us. Now, if you get fast enough with the visual editor and you're familiar with all of the features, you can actually write this logic pretty quickly using the tool, but I just wanted to mention that relative to, say, handwriting this code with Kotlin extensions or something like that, I didn't feel like I saved much time. Okay, so with all of that criticism in mind, and let's just keep in mind this is a fairly new tool, I did like the navigation feature in the parts of the app where it didn't cause any problems. It worked quite well in that regard. In particular, I do like the safe args option for basically sending type safe arguments between different screens of your application, and I will be demonstrating that feature today. So my verdict on this library is that while I wouldn't really recommend it yet based on the boilerplate and poor integration with some common use cases, I'm not going to say don't use it either. Give it a try and let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Finally, if you'd like to follow along with this tutorial, please clone or download the repository, link in the description box down below. Okay, so the first thing we'll do is we'll look at configuring this thing with Gradle. So in your build script function here in your project level build Gradle file, we need to add a particular configuration to the build script dependencies. In particular, we need to add this thing here, androidx.navigation:navigation safeargs, blah, blah, blah. And once you add this thing in, that's going to allow you to use the safeargs plugin. And what we'll do next is we'll see how to add that to the module level build Gradle file. In the module level build Gradle file, you're going to want to add up at the top here, apply plugin androidx.navigation.safeargs.kotlin. Now, if you're in Java, you're going to want to probably delete the .kotlin, and I think that's the appropriate plugin for Java. Anyways, down in the dependencies, the two dependencies that we'll really be working with are the navigation-fragment-ktx and the navigation-UI-ktx. So again, I think if you're working with Java or something like that, you just delete the -ktx and it'll work for you. But there is a page where you can figure out the particular dependencies, so just go check that out in the Android documentation. Okay, so let's get started building out the navigation component. So the first thing we're going to need is a navigation graph, and this is basically like an XML resource which specifies all the different destinations which our navigation component can travel to, along with plenty of other details. So what I'd like you to do, so presumably you have downloaded the repository, so go ahead and in the res navigation directory, just notice we have this file navgraph, which is what we will be building. What we'll do is we'll create another file. So I'm just going to right click on navigation. We'll go to navigation resource file, and we're going to call this navgraph demo. You can call it whatever you like. And so what we'll do is we'll basically rebuild this navgraph file over here, and I just want to have it there so that you can reference it. So here we have the navigation editor. So we've got a couple different things here. On the side panel, we have this destinations tab here. And as you can see, we don't currently have any destinations and no NavHostFragments is found. So we can go ahead and ignore that for a minute. And what I'd like you to do is we've got this new destination button up here. So go ahead and click on that one. And it's basically what we're going to do is we're going to add all the different fragments and or activities which we want to be able to navigate to. And these things are known in this library as destinations, obviously. So we'll need to add the note detail view fragment. Then I'm just going to add in the note list fragment. And as I mentioned before, just due to the integration limitations with onActivity result, we're not actually going to jump to the login view, which is a fragment. We're actually going to have to jump to the login activity. So we'll just select this option here. All right, so we've added all the different destinations, but as you can see, we have a little bit of work to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm basically just going to click and drag these things storyboard style into roughly where I want them. So we're going to drag login activity up here, and we'll, note list view is actually kind of like the main sort of dashboard of the application. And we'll bring note detail view down here. And before we do anything else, I just want to do a little bit of cleanup. Okay, so we've added our destinations, but I think we need to hop into the text editor for a minute and just make a couple of adjustments. So I'd like to be able to actually preview visually the screens that are that the application has in each given destination. And one of the ways we can do that is we can use this tools layout attribute here. So for those who aren't aware, the tools namespace is basically like a design time namespace, and whatever details you add here actually get stripped out of the packaged application. So in this case, we don't actually want to refer to the activity login layout because the activity login is just a container. What we'll want is, I believe it's called fragment login. There we go. And as you can see, that should fix that up. There we go. That's exactly what I'm talking about there. So we'll just add that in for the other fragment destinations here. So in this one, here I'll zoom in a little for everybody. So in that one, that's going to be fragment note detail. And then up above here, fragment note list. All right, loading, and that's looking a lot better, except I think I've reversed them. Okay, so this is fragment node detail. You know, I could edit this out, but I'm just going to leave this in here. That's it's pretty spectacular, Ryan. Okay, and let's just hop back to the design editor. Okay, that looks more like it. So as you can see, it's added a 2 onto these names because we've already defined them in the other file, but that's totally fine. Okay, so the way that we actually kind of define how to navigate between these different destinations is by setting up actions. So the way that you set up actions in the visual editor is you'll notice a lot like constraint layout. Each of these different destinations will have this little thing you can click on here. So you can click and drag that to a particular destination. And what that has done here is it's added this arrow, and the arrow basically represents an action. So go ahead and do that. Now, how this thing basically works is that the note list view is able to jump to either the login activity, or it's able to jump to the note detail activity. So I'm just going to click there again. Oop, come on. There we go. and I'm going to click and drag that to the note detail view. Now in this particular case, once the user is done messing around with the note detail view, either when they hit the delete button, kind of hard to see, but yeah, there's either a delete or a checkmark button there. So once the user does that, then they're basically going to jump back to the note list view. So I'm going to select note detail view, and then I'm going to click and drag this one. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. And we'll just have it point back to the note list view. So as you can see, we've defined pretty much all of the different actions or navigation actions which we'd like the application to be capable of implementing. There is one last thing we need to do here though. Well, there might be a couple of things, but what we need to do is, in this particular case, often what will happen is, this is basically like a list view, and oftentimes the user will be selecting an item in a recycler view here, and then we'll need to send the ID of that item over to the note detail view. And this is a very common pattern. You'll see this all the time. It's a lot better than actually sending the whole note item. You just send the ID over. So what we can do there is we're going to click on the action between the note list destination and the note detail destination here. And I'm going to click on the attributes panel here. And what we can do is we can actually add some argument values to note detail view. Sorry, don't actually click on the action here. Click on note detail view, and this is where we can add arguments. So in this tab here, we have arguments. We're just going to hit plus. And so the name of this argument is going to be note ID. Definitely try and give it a good name, of course. The inferred type is going to be a string. Sorry, not the inferred type. The type is going to be a string. You can select inferred type, but we're just going to use some simple data here. And then it's not going to be nullable, and we don't really care especially about a default value in this case. So yeah, just go ahead and type note ID, select string as a type, and hit add. And so just as a reminder to everyone, all of the stuff we're doing in the visual editor is basically just creating a whole bunch of boilerplate in the XML for us. So what we can do here is, now that I've added that particular argument to our note detail view, it's added this little entry down here. So that's basically all we need to do to actually configure this thing properly. Just one final note here, up in the top of the navigation tab here, we have this app start destination attribute. So this is where you specify basically which particular destination you want to start the application from. And in this case, we don't want to start in note detail view. We want to start in the note list view. So I'm just going to type note list view 2 or whatever name it has, and that'll be the starting point of the application. Now, when I say starting point of the application, that's assuming that your application's manifest file points to the activity, which will be basically like the host for our navigation setup, and we'll look at that in a moment. Okay, so now that we've built out this particular XML file here, what I'm going to suggest you do is, unless you actually want to keep this thing just for notes or something like that, please go ahead and delete this file we just created, because we want to actually be using the old file just so it works well with everything in our application. I just wanted to show you the actual process of building out the navigation graph using the design editor. Alright, so now that we've got our navigation graph set up, what we can do is we can set up our NavHostFragment. Now, again, just a really quick bit of practical information here. What I would suggest is, one of the goals of this particular library is to go for a single activity approach. I think that's totally great, except as I mentioned before, I literally wasn't able to do that due to library limitation. But what I'm going to suggest to people is for different features of your application where you're running into trouble with this particular library, my recommendation is to just pull that into a separate activity, and you can apply like a model view presenter or whatever to that particular feature of the application. Just have your navigation graph point to its activity instead of the fragment, and then just do what you would normally do. And when you need to jump back into the navigation graph, you're of course going to have to start the sort of navigation host activity, which in this case is note activity. So anyways, enough rambling. Let's go ahead and configure that note activity. And so the note activity basically manages both the note detail view and the note list view. Okay, so what we'll do is, again, we're going to create an extra file which we'll delete afterwards. So just go ahead and right click on the layout here, and we're going to go to new layout resource file. And this file is going to be called activity note demo. And for the root layout, we're going to select a constraint layout. There we go. And that's what we'll start with here. Okay, so what we need to do here is we need to add this thing called a NavHostFragment. And we could add that manually, but there's actually a way to do it really quickly in the design editor. So in the palette here, just on the side, there's the containers menu here. And in the containers menu, you're going to find down below this thing called NavHostFragment. So what you'll want to do is just click and drag this NavHostFragment. We can center it. It doesn't really especially matter here. And it's going to give you a list of navigation graphs to select from. Of course, select nav graph. And as you can see here, it's done most of the work for us. We're just going to hop into the text editor. So for the layout width, we're going to say match parent. Same thing for the layout height. And there's a couple other things we can just remove the absolute layout editor here. So we're specifying the navigation graph that we built. We have this thing set as the default nav host. So this is kind of like a default configuration, which will work kind of easier. And then also when we see this Android name attribute, this actually refers to the particular class name of whatever fragment. So in this case, just note that NavHostFragment is not something that we are going to actually create. We're going to use the default implementation, and this is basically how we point to it up here. Now, in this application, we of course call this thing fragment, I can't type, fragment nav. But yeah, this is basically all the configuration we need to do, and then what you can do is just go ahead and delete this file or keep it if you like. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to have a nav controller, which generally speaking will be an activity. So what we're going to do is in the note package of our main package here, just open that up. And so the file we'll be rebuilding, it won't take long, is note activity. And again, what we'll do is just right click on note, go to new Kotlin or Java class, whichever you prefer. Go to note type note activity demo. And don't worry about actually creating a proper activity and adding it to the manifest. Okay, so what we'll do next is we'll just type class note activity demo, and then that thing is going to extend app compat activity like so. Give it a constructor, and the particular function that we're going to need to add in here is we'll need to override on create. So usually it'll auto complete for us here. Let's see. Let's go with this option here. Okay, so what we basically need to do here is we need a nav controller object, which fortunately is super easy to create. And what we'll basically do is when we need to actually perform these navigation operations, we'll be basically getting a hook to this nav controller through the library. So anyways, what you need to do is go ahead and add private late init var nav, and that's going to be of type nav controller. Like so. And then we need to create this nav controller. So we'll say nav equals navigation dot find nav controller. And what we'll do is we'll pass this for the activity. And then it also requires a layout res ID, which is the NavHostFragment. And so the NavHostFragment is basically what we sort of swap the views in and out of. So in that case, that thing is called r.id.fragmentNav, like so. So it's complaining that I need to import R, but I'm just not going to worry about that. If I hop over to note activity, as you can see, that's actually all we need to do. And this was one part of setting this thing up that was actually like really quick and painless. So now that we've got that done, we can actually take a look at how to actually use this library in action. Okay, so I'm going to open up Note List View, and we'll look at some different ways to actually use this library to navigate to different destinations. So I'm going to hit Control-N, Note List View, and we'll just look at two particular situations here. So in the first case, we have a situation where we're basically just navigating to a particular destination without any arguments. So there's actually a lot of different options we have, as we can see, for navigation. So basically how this tool pretty much works is, at least when we're calling it from a fragment here, we have this find NavController function. So what happens is we call find NavController, and that's of course going to, through the framework, grab this thing we have here in the activity. And then we can perform navigate operations, among other things, to jump to different destinations. So this is almost kind of equivalent to like saying start activity, except we're not working with activities here. So I just want to bring your attention. So if I click within the parentheses of this navigate function here and hit Control P, I just want you to notice that there are a lot of different options for what you can pass here. So in a really simple case, we basically just pass it the ID of a particular destination. So we have r.id login view. If I hop into the nav graph here, just notice that if we go to this activity, the ID of this destination is login view. So that's where that's coming from. So that's kind of the first case. Now, what about when we actually want to pass arguments, type safe arguments to a particular destination? And let me tell you, this is one of the things that I actually quite like about this library, and probably the main reason why I'm actually doing this video, to be honest, is the safe arguments feature here. So when you want to navigate with arguments to a particular feature, so in this case we want to go to the note detail view and here, and we need to pass some kind of ID to it. So when we're creating a new note, so when the user hits the create new, this is like a floating action button and they want to create a new note, then we pass just an empty note ID, and just understand that on the other side, note detail fragment and its view model is going to be aware that this is a new note. So that's just in case you're wondering why we're passing that. Now, what we need to do when we actually want to jump to a particular destination with arguments is we need to use this note list view directions.action note list view to note detail view. Where the hell did that come from? Obviously, we didn't write that. So this is kind of one of the main points of this library, is that the work you do in the XML will generate some functions like this that you can use to perform these different navigation operations. So obviously in the simple case, we can just call navigate. In this case, we need to use this note list view directions object, and where this function came from and this, where this class came from and this function of the class came from is based on some generated code from our XML configuration here. So with that in mind, you may need to build your project in order to actually create these things, because I'm pretty sure they're made at compile time. So in this case, once we've created our direction and we've given it the particular action and the arguments that are required of that action, and all of this has been generated for us, then we pass that direction object to our nav controller, and then that's how we actually get to the other fragment with the arguments. Okay, so the last thing we'll do is we'll look at how to get the arguments out of our receiving destination, which in this case is of course a fragment. So I'm going to scroll down to the viewModel.handle event function here that's within onStart. And so basically what goes on is we have this note detail view args object, which is of course generated for us. Then we call .fromBundle, and we supply the arguments property of this fragment. And then where does .note ID come from? So this is actually the name of the arguments that we defined in the nav graph, as you can see here. And in this case, once we grab those arguments, we just pass them to the view model in the form of a sealed event class, and then the application figures out what to do from there. So that's the basics of the Android Jetpack navigation library. Hopefully you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do me a favor and hit the like button down below. Consider subscribing, and in this particular case, I'm quite curious to hear what other developers think about the library, so please do, if you've actually used it and tested it, please do consider posting a comment below, and just let me know whether you think it's a library which is something you plan on using in production code, or something that you've been having some troubles with as well. So anyways, none of this was said to disparage the Android team for building these great libraries. I'm super appreciative of what they're doing with Android Jetpack, and yeah, that's basically it. Thank you for watching, and peace out.